Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by thanking the Royal College for extending this invitation to me to be part of this beautiful series of webinars. And I want to thank the organizers and in particular Dr. Hassan Shahata and Dr. Rani Thakur, the Vice President of the College for Global Affairs. Now, my contribution today is about ovarian reserve and whether we can use it as a guide for ovarian stimulation. And let me start by reiterating the fact that IVF and ICSI are now established methods for the treatment of many cases of infertility. Today we have about 8 million babies born to IVF and its related techniques. But from the beginning, it was clear that the results are not 100%. These are the American statistics showing that the success rate is like a 1 in 3. And if we repeat the cycle 3 times, maybe it's about 2 in 3. But of course, there are people who do not become pregnant. There are many reasons for this. And one of these reasons is that the patient, the lady, may have poor ovarian reserve. But what is ovarian reserve? Well, ovarian reserve literally means the number and quality of oocytes remaining in the ovaries of this woman at a given time. And it is thought to reflect her potential for becoming pregnant and producing offspring. Now here we want to differentiate between two things. The true ovarian reserve, which is really a histological term. We can only know this by doing histology, by taking the ovary and doing histological examination, which is something not practical, of course. But instead, we talk about the functional ovarian reserve, which is really the ovarian response, because this reflects the response of the ovary to stimulation. You give a stimulation and you look for the response. The response may be poor, it may be adequate in most of the people, and sometimes it is excessive. Now, what is response to stimulation in our case? Now, a response to stimulation-assisted reproduction is either we stimulate the ovary and we look for the response in terms of increase in the level of estradiol in the plasma, or we look by ultrasound and see the number and size of the growing follicles, or we do the IVF and collect the number of oocytes and we see how many we have retrieved. Now, if we are talking about estradiol, measurement of hormones, of course, is always associated with variations. There are inter-laboratory variations, there are intra-laboratory variations, so it's not that accurate. Also, the number of growing follicles. An observer will look by ultrasound and can see 7 follicles, for example. Another one will say, no, I can see an 8th one, a little bit in a different plane, for example. But if you're talking about the number of oocytes collected, it is an integral number. It cannot be 6.5 or 7.75. It's either 6 or 7 or 8. This is why, in our humble opinion, the response to stimulation should be evaluated in terms of the oocytes retrieved, particularly if we are looking for a definition for the response. Because in this seminal paper by Surrey and Schoolcraft, published 20 years ago, they were trying to evaluate the different strategies for the management of poor response. And what they found, they said, as you can see at the bottom end of the slide, they say that we have found there is no uniform definition. In fact, they said that there were about 28 definitions that people were using to evaluate poor response. So we really need a definition. And this is what we have done 15 years ago. We thought that maybe in our reasoning, we said, if we have a pregnancy rate of 40% when we collect 10 oocytes, and if we collect 5 oocytes, we still have a pregnancy rate of 40%. So why do we need to collect 10 oocytes? Well, 5 will be enough. But if we collect 4 oocytes and then our pregnancy rate drops to 20%, then this must be the significant drop. This must be our definition of poor response. We don't want to have 4, we want to have more than 4. And how can you do this? You do this by doing receiver operating characteristic curves, which we did and published, as I say, in the year 2005. We analyzed 754 of our consecutive patients at that time, and we constructed the receiver operating characteristic curves. And what did we see? We saw that if we are talking about ICSI, where the pelvis is a clean pelvis and everything is fine except that we have oligoteratu or maybe athenospermia, the critical point, the cutoff point was 5 oocytes. We needed 5 oocytes. We didn't want to have less than 5 oocytes. But if we're talking about IVF patients where the pelvis may be a little bit infected, there may be a frozen pelvis, we may have endometriosis, in which case we need 1 extra oocytes, and our cutoff point at that time was, in these patients, was 6. And if we are talking about patients who are undergoing testicular sperm ICSI, particularly if this sperm is in a case of non-obstructive vasospasmia, then the sperm are not very good, in which case our cutoff point was 8. So in our definition, we thought that the definition, if you're talking about IVF, it will be 6, ICSI 5, and testicular sperm will be 8. And this was published in 2005. Our work was repeated after that. 1 year later, van der Gast and his colleagues did their study on a much larger number of patients, and they came up with a cutoff point of 4. 10 years later, Dracopoulos did the same and found that the cutoff point was 4. 2 years after that, Polizos Italia found that 7 was the cutoff point. So this is concerning the poor response. Because the other side of the coin is to look at hyper-response, the cutoff point after which patients will develop severe ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. This is something that Magnussen had done in 2018, and he came up with a cutoff point of 18. There is no universal definition, as we all know, and the definition taken by most of the people is 15 oocytes, although it is not really technically evidence-based. Now, enough for the definition of poor responders. What about the prediction? Now, in order to predict the response, we can do dynamic tests or we can look at static markers. Now, dynamic test means what? We stimulate the ovary and we look for the response. We give GnRH, we give FSH, or we give clomiphene citrate. And this is the work of Galtier-Durer. What he did, he injected GnRH and he looked at trying to stimulate the pituitary, and he measured estradiol. Renato Fonchen from Clamart did another thing. He stimulated the FSH and he came up with his E4 test. He stimulates with FSH and then he looks for E2. While Tambo Italia said we will do something cheaper, we will give clomiphene citrate to stimulate both the hypothalamus and the pituitary and look for the response by measuring FSH. Well, these are the dynamic tests, but of course it's simpler to do the static markers. 1 test and that's all, or even to look at the age, basal or day 3 FSH, day 3 inhibin B, the antral follicle count, the anti-Mullerian hormone, or even the ovarian volume. But which one of them is a better predictor? Now, Alazemi Italia tried in this paper to compare 4 predictors, and what you can see and what is expected, the AMH was the best predictor in their study, followed by FSH day 3, followed by day 3 inhibin B, and followed even by age. And this is by while trying to predict the ovarian response of the ovarian reserve, because you see there is a nice curve. Because if they are when they tried to predict clinical pregnancy, the curve started to flatten. It's not a beautiful curve anymore. And why is that? Because pregnancy does not only depend on the response. You may have a very good response and collect a good number of oocytes, but the patient does not become pregnant because we had a problem in embryo transfer. The endometrial receptivity was not good. Luteal phase support is not the same in all the patients. So trying to predict the clinical pregnancy by these markers is bound to be difficult. But of course it boils up that the 2 important markers are the antral follicle count and the anti-Mullerian hormone. And this is the study by Qui Italia, trying to come up with a cutoff point of antral follicle count, and what he saw here was a cutoff point of 6. And the other side of the coin, when he tried to predict hyper response, it was between 14 and 16, so it was again 15, and this is why many people are taking this is 15 antral follicle count. So people take 15 as a cutoff point for hyperstimulation. And this is the work by Brouwer, trying to see if AMH is better or AFC is better. We know that both of them are good, are the best predictors, but which one of them is better? This is the study with the beauty of the receiver operating characteristic curve, or what people call the ROC curves, is that you can compare the two predictors. And as you can see here, if you're trying to predict poor response, the AMH has a slight edge over AFC. On the contrary, if you want to predict hyper response, AFC has a very slight edge over AMH, but both of them are really good predictors. And the other predictor which is good, but which is a little bit takes a little bit more time, is to measure the ovarian volume. And usually we will do this with 3D or 4D ultrasound, which is more expensive and takes more time and so on. But it is a good predictor according to the work of Danninger, as you can see here. Was about yes, but also Nelson did something else. He said, I'm going to use AFC. Of course, we can use AMH, and we can see again, can use again AFC, the antral follicle count. So again, if it's less than 2 or between 2 and 10, between 10 and 24, that's the normal response, and above 24, that will be the hyper response, in which case we will use the antagonist protocol, and if it's above 40, we will also do the agonist trigger rather than trigger with HCG to try to eliminate the possibility of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So people use these predictors to choose the ovarian stimulation protocol. The other side of the coin, John Jovish in Australia, in Perth in Australia, used this pivot algorithm for hyper responders. So again, depending on and it is an AFC based algorithm, in which case he would adjust his dose according to the number of antral follicle count. But do these algorithms work? Now, this is the study by Nibo Anderson and his colleagues, Juan Garcia Velasco and Bart Fauser, a big multinational study, which was, as you can see, AMH based. They measured the AMH, and according to the AMH, they tried to individualize their dose. And this was a multi-center randomized controlled trial. And this is how they did it. They measured the serum AMH, and they decided the daily dose, which was fixed throughout the stimulation. And what was the answer? The answer is that it doesn't work. The oocyte yield was the same, blastocyst number the same, ongoing pregnancy rate the same, live birth rate the same. The only thing is that ovarian hyperstimulation was diminished in if you are expecting a hyper response and you diminish the dose. And this is another study by Van Tierborg and her colleagues, but this one was AFC based. They measured the antral follicle count, and again they individualized the FSH dose accordingly. And does it work? The short answer is no. As you can see in red at the bottom of the slide, the AFC based individualized FSH dosing does not improve the live birth rate rates or reduces the cost as compared to a standard FSH dose. This is when they were taking all their patients together. When they started, and this is the curve, no difference really, the two curves are superimposed, the standard group and the individualized group. This is all the patients. When they started to do subgroup analysis, they took the poor responders alone. And when they look at the poor responders, again, it was the same answer. It does not, individualizing the protocol according to the AFC, does not improve the live birth rate. And these are the curves again. When they look at their hyper responders, there was something. First of all, no change in the live birth rate, similar cumulative live birth rate, but a lower occurrence of any grade of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So, regarding the cumulative birth rate, no change, but regarding the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, there was a drop if you do your individualized protocol. Number of oocyte of OHSS events was diminished, and particularly the mild and the moderate cases. So it seems that individualization of your protocol according to your predictor does not improve your pregnancy rate or live birth rate, but it may diminish the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So people said maybe we can combine our predictors. You remember, for example, if you want to predict Down syndrome, we can use nuchal translucency on its own. We can use the biochemical markers on their own. Each one of them gives us a certain prediction, but if we combine them and do the combined test, we increase the prediction power. And this is what Brouwer Italia tried to do in 2013. They said maybe, anyway, they compared different combinations, and they said, well, age plus AFC plus AMH plus FSH is probably the best combination of markers. Here, trying to predict the ovarian reserve, as we can see. But of course, trying to predict clinical pregnancy, as we said before, is not that easy, because pregnancy does not only depend on the ovarian response. No, you may have an excellent response, but the patient does not become pregnant because you had a problem during embryo transfer. You had luteal phase support is not the same, endometrial receptivity is not the same for all patients. So these are the different combinations that people have used, and they have used them for two things. Number one, to choose the appropriate protocol, and number two is to determine the starting dose of FSH. So we have the study of Popovic-Todorovic from Denmark. We have the constant algorithm by François Oliven from France. Lamarca and Sunkara came up with their own algorithm, and the Poseidon group, Sandor Esteves, Peter Humaydan, and Haar came up with their Poseidon stratification, as they call it. Now, this is the Popovic-Todorovic nomogram, and again, what she did with her colleagues is to combine antral follicles, ovarian volume, Doppler score, age, and smoking habits, but the answer is that there was no change in the total number of follicles, number of repeat oocytes, total dose of FSH, the risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. They said that the ongoing pregnancy rate was increased when you use your individual dose, and this is the result just above the p-value. But let's see if their results could be confirmed. This was 2003. Because in 2009, when François Oliven and his colleagues Colin Howells and Mats Wickland and Marc Germain tried to do their study using FSH, BMI, age, and AFC to determine the starting dose of recombinant FSH, their results were not that good. The implantation rate was the same, pregnancy rate was the same, live birth rate was the same, and in fact, if anything, the starting dose, the standard dosing, gave them a larger number of oocytes, although we would have expected that tailoring the dose would give us more oocytes, but it didn't. It was the contrary, so it doesn't work. This is the nomogram that Antonio Lamarca and Cesc Sunkara came with. They have two nomograms. This one is using AMH. They said, give us your level of AMH, give us the age of the patient, give us the day 3 FSH, and we will tell you the starting dose of FSH, as you can see here. And it happens here to be 2 ampoules 150 international units, for example. This is the nomogram based on AMH, because they have another nomogram based on AFC. And again, give us your AFC, give us the age, give us day 3 FSH, and we will tell you the starting dose. Again, in this particular example, was 2 ampoules 150 international units, as you can see. But Does it work? Now, this is Allegra Italia in 2017. They tried to apply this nomogram versus no nomogram, and they used the AMH-based nomogram of La Marca and Sunkara, and as you can see, fertilization rate the same, implantation rate the same, clinical pregnancy rate the same, and the number of couples of embryos even the same. So it doesn't seem to be working again. Now, this is the Poseidon group classification. Again, they tried to classify the patients into 4 groups, either less than 35 years, and those are more than 35 years, and each one of them with good predictors and poor predictors, and then trying to come up with the proper protocol to use, or maybe the dose also to use. But so far, we are waiting for the randomized, prospective randomized control trial to see if this particular nomogram or proposition is going to work. And this is what their strategy is. In fact, this is what they have suggested, particularly for Poseidon groups 3 and 4, waiting for the randomized control trial. Because so far, this is the Cochrane review published 2018, which showed that in normal responders, individualized versus conventional ovarian stimulation, no change in live birth rate or ongoing pregnancy rate. In low responders, no change in live birth or ongoing pregnancy rate. And even in hyper responders, and there is no change in live birth rate or ongoing pregnancy rate. And this confirms what we have been saying all the time. It does not change your success rate. It may only diminish your ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Unfortunately, the Cochrane group found that they could not study the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Because if you really think about it carefully, what can you obtain by flogging an already tired horse? You are not going to extract more, get more follicles or extract more oocytes. But maybe if we have hyperresponder, we can diminish the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Which brings us to another way of thinking. Now, for these poor responders, if increasing the dose or stratifying the dose does not give you a good, does not improve your success rate, your live birth rate, or your clinical pregnancy rate, why should we use a very strong protocol? Maybe the mild ovarian stimulation would be the answer. But mind you, what is mild stimulation protocol? Now, this is the definition by ISMAR, which I think everybody should look at it carefully, because people, when they talk about mild stimulation, sometimes they include natural cycles or modified natural cycles, or patients who are taking clomiphene citrate. Now, this is not mild stimulation. Mild stimulation is giving FSH or HMG, but giving a small dose, 2 or 3 ampoules, and using the antagonist protocol, and with or without tablets like clomiphene citrate or letrozole. And in fact, we did a meta-analysis, and we presented it in the last ASRM in last October 2019. And as you can see, we didn't find any difference in clinical pregnancy rate or ongoing pregnancy rate, whether you when you use the mild protocol versus the long luteal agonist protocol in these poor responders. And in fact, last week, this August 2020, this paper was published. It is again a systematic review and a meta-analysis by the group of Geeta Nargund with Professor Stuart Campbell. And as you can see, again, the mild stimulation for poor responders, live birth rate was the same, cycle cancellations were the same, and even embryos and high-grade embryos, in fact, if anything, they were a little bit higher, although it did not reach significance. As you can see, the confidence intervals are just reaching a significance 0.99 to 1.92. So maybe if you increase the numbers, we will get a better answer. So it seems that mild stimulation compared to conventional stimulation in these poor responders may have a little edge, at least by judging the number and the quality of embryos you obtain. And now came the Bologna consensus. Now, the group of Bologna tried to come up with a definition for poor responders. And what they did, they tried, in fact, to imitate what the Rotterdam group did for PCOS. But polycystic ovarian syndrome is a syndrome. We don't really know. It's not a disease. We don't really know. It's still enigmatic. But in our case, poor responders are poor responders. They are poor people who respond poorly by producing smaller number of oocytes, or as we said, fewer follicles or a lower amount of estradiol. But it's easier if we count the oocytes collected, because what they have tried to do is to mix up the, they said we are going to use the definition as 2 out of 3, the advanced maternal age, and they took the cutoff point of 40, a previous poor ovarian response, and they took a cutoff point of 3, and abnormal reserve test, and they took a range of cutoff points between 5 and 7 nanogram per, the AFC between 5 and 7 follicles, and the AMH between 0.5 and 1.1 nanogram per milliliter. Now, this Bologna consensus was criticized by us and by others because of two things. The first thing, that it is not evidence-based. Who said that the cutoff point of age is 40? We have many papers saying that it is between 37 and 35, while many people would tell you that fertility will start to diminish around 35. But there is a study by Al-Azemi looking at doing a receiver operating characteristic curves, which is the scientific way of coming with cutoff points, and it is 37. And again, we have many studies coming up with cutoff points for AFC and AMH. But what is more important is that it confuses the aims with the means, with the aim with the means. Now, the predictors are meant to be used to predict the response. We cannot use the predictors to define the response. The predictors are predictors. They cannot be part of the definition. So in our humble but logical understanding, this confuses the aim with the means. But, as we all know, as we say in French, la raison du plus fort est toujours la meilleure. Nous l'avons démontré tout à l'heure, which translates in English as might is right. Even if some people come with a logical answer, it may not find its way to the truth. So this is again the Poseidon certification in our humble but logical and evidence-based thinking. Again, it is mixing the aim with the means, because again it mixes the oocytes with, which is the aim, with the AFC and AMH, which are the predictors. So in our humble opinion, it is not going to show us much. The people are going still to come up with different conclusions. But there is hope, at least in a subgroup of patients. And this comes from the genetic markers of ovarian response. We know from many studies shown here that there is single nucleotide polymorphism in the Fsh receptor. This is the Fss receptor on the left side. It is located, it is embedded in the cell wall, cell membrane of the ovarian cells. And as you can see, because it's a big, the FSH molecules is 22,400 Daltons, so it's a big molecule. It cannot go through the cell membrane. So the Fsh receptor is located on the wall of the cell, as you can see here. But sometimes changes happen, at least in one single nucleotide, as you can see on the right side. Instead of guanine and cytosine, this has changed. There was a SNP resulting in adenine and thymine instead. And it seems that there are many of these variations which have been described by many people. And according to the study of Alvegi, as you can see here, this meta-analysis, if you compare in the top panel the GG versus the AA, guanine versus adenine, you find that this GG has consumes more FSH than AA to reach the same response, and AG consumes more than AA, but if you compare GG to the AG, it is the same in terms of FSH consumption. If you look at the stimulation duration, you will find that AA will take more duration to reach the same response compared to GG, and AA again takes a longer stimulation time compared to AG, but there is no difference between AG and GG. And if we are talking about the number of oocytes retrieved, again, GG gives you more oocytes with the same amount of FSH compared to AA, AG compared to AA, and no difference between AG and GG. So the future may lie really in genetics and epigenetics, at least in this subgroup of patients. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the true ovarian reserve is difficult to determine because it needs dissection, it needs histology. Instead, we measure the function reserve to predict ovarian response to stimulation. Many markers exist to predict ovarian response, but AMH and AFC are the best predictors. Algorithms and nomograms have been devised to help two things: choose the appropriate stimulation protocol and deciding or determining the starting dose of FSH. But randomized controlled trials have shown that these algorithms do not improve the pregnancy rate or the live birth rate, but they can diminish the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome incidence. And more studies are needed to determine whether it's either that these algorithms are of no value, or maybe that we did not find the right algorithm so far. And finally, the answer, at least in a subgroup of patients, may lie with the SNPs in the FSH receptors. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.